So, my name is Amaddeep Jutla. I am a postdoc at Columbia University, and I'm here to talk about resting state functional connectivity in youth with autism spectrum disorder and psychotic-like symptoms. Now, in order to give you kind of an overview of why I'm interested in this, autism and psychotic-like symptoms, I want to kind of give you a sort of a broad 10,000 foot view overview of autism and schizophrenia. Autism and schizophrenia are kind of interesting because if you look at the DSM, they are two separate disorders. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder. Schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder. Autism is typically diagnosed in childhood. Schizophrenia is typically diagnosed in late adolescence, early adulthood. Autism is characterized by repetitive behavior, restricted interests, social communication deficits, and in schizophrenia, the hallmark is psychosis. So, loss of contact with reality, hallucinations, delusional beliefs, etc. So on paper, they seem very different. But what's interesting about these disorders is if you look back historically, they were not always as distinct as they are now. When schizophrenia was really first described, one of the cardinal symptoms of it was actually autism. So the word autism was coined in order to describe a feature of schizophrenia, which was the fact that people with schizophrenia often seem a little bit blunted emotionally and a little bit withdrawn, kind of in their own world. So hence the autism. Similarly, when autism itself was first described in the mid 20th century, it was called autism, but it was also called childhood schizophrenia. For a period of 20 or so years, autism and childhood schizophrenia were terms that were basically used interchangeably. And it was not until really the late 70s, early 80s that this sort of bifurcation came about. And even so, even though we now consider them separate, there's a lot of overlap between the two. There is now pretty good meta-analytic evidence that people who have autism are at significantly increased risk of developing schizophrenia. So they're at 3 to 4 times the risk relative to the general population. And this can be a problem because people who have autism, there's some evidence that suggests that they are under-referred to early psychosis treatment clinics. Often there's sort of a diagnostic overshadowing phenomenon that happens where clinicians will say, oh, this person maybe seems to be having delusions or something, but it's probably just a function of the autism. It's probably not emerging schizophrenia. So there are issues diagnostically. And the problem with this is that it can lead to sort of poor long-term outcomes. Because really, in terms of the difference between these disorders, one big difference between them is that people who have autism tend to have pretty good outcomes if you go down 10, 20 years from the point of diagnosis. Versus people with schizophrenia, often they kind of will tend to deteriorate over time, and often they do better with early detection of the psychosis. And so if you're able to reduce the duration of untreated psychosis, you have better outcomes. So what this means is that because people with autism are at elevated risk, what we want to do is we want to try to see if we can detect them as early as possible and try to reduce duration of untreated psychosis if and when some of them convert over to schizophrenia. Now, this all sort of sounds good, but there are a couple of issues with this. One is that, so we know that autism predicts schizophrenia, but does autism predict prodromal psychosis? So does autism predict sort of the first inklings of schizophrenia that you might see in late childhood and early adolescence? We don't necessarily know whether or not that's the case. We also don't know whether youth who have autism have a neural signature that could help facilitate early identification. So we don't know if you could do an fMRI scan and you could differentiate kind of the psychosis-prone autism from the non-psychosis-prone autism in a child population. The other piece, which isn't really mentioned directly on this slide, but the other piece that's sort of the elephant in the room here is that there's this 3 to 4-fold risk, and so I have this in big letters here like it's a big deal. But when you really think about this in absolute terms, the general population's risk of developing schizophrenia is about 1%. So if people who have autism are at 3 to 4 times the risk, that means they're at 3 to 4%, in terms of how likely they are to develop schizophrenia. So even though the increase in risk is huge, in absolute terms, it's pretty small. And what that means is that you would need really large sample sizes in order to capture a population where you'd be able to explore this question adequately. As a postdoc, I have trouble, recruiting large populations. And so that kind of brings me to the point of looking into creative ways to do kind of secondary data analyses, or looking at existing data sets and seeing if I'm able to explore this question of autism and schizophrenia that's interesting to me. And so where that sort of brought me was the ABCD cohort. So this is the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development cohort. So this is a large study funded by NIDA. The goal has been to recruit about 10,000 youth in middle childhood, so ages about 9 to 11. And the idea has been to follow them into adolescence and into early adulthood. And given sort of the, the NIDA impetus behind this, a lot of the focus on this cohort is going to be kind of trying to look at drug use, proneness to drug use, and kind of how that unfolds throughout adolescence. That being said, in this cohort, there are measures that are relevant to the question that I want to answer here. So there was an ASD screen that was given to all but 39 of these 11,000 or 11,000 plus youth. There was also what's known as the PQBC, this Prodromal questionnaire brief child version, that was given to all but 15 of these youth. So we have some data points related to autism and related to psychosis. And again, this population is really not a clinical population. It's meant to reflect the general population. It's been meant to reflect just, children in middle childhood in the United States. But in a way, that's kind of a strength, because that means that because this study was sort of not really designed with any particular interest in either autism or psychosis, then if this relationship does exist, and if this relationship is interesting, we should be able to maybe pull something out that would be interesting. The other nice thing, of course, about ABCD is that related to the neural signature that I had talked about, we have fMRI data on just about all of these youth. So okay, so you look at this data set, and in this whole data set, there are about 500, closer to 600, I guess, youth who have psychotic-like symptoms but don't have ASD. Psychotic-like symptoms, we identified that using a cutoff on this Prodromal questionnaire. There are just under 200 youth who have ASD but no psychotic-like symptoms, and there are about 25 who have both ASD and psychotic-like symptoms. So you can already kind of see here that there's a little bit of an overrepresentation. There are some other interesting things that we found in this data purely from a clinical standpoint, and we have a manuscript that is in submission and that is on medRxiv, and I'm going to, in the last slide, I'm going to point you to the link to that if you'd like to check it out. So you can read more about kind of what we did from a clinical standpoint. This talk is going to be more focusing on the neuroimaging data. Now with the neuroimaging data, we have, what we did was we looked at kids who were scanned using a Siemens scanner. And the reason for that is because there were some issues in the ABCD data set related to data that was collected with, I think, with a Philips scanner. And so, and if we wanted to look at the other brands that weren't Philips, but that, Siemens and various other brands, we would have to co-vary for that. There was some complexity involved there. And so in order to kind of simplify things, it looked like most of the kids really were scanned using a Siemens machine. So, okay, we only looked at these kids, and this is still over half of the kids. When you look in this data set, you see, just under 300 kids have psychotic symptoms. About 80 or so of these kids have ASD. And then unfortunately, again, just not very many have ASD and psychotic-like symptoms. So looking at it, just from a pure numbers standpoint, you can see that we may be able to answer some questions about the psychotic-like symptoms, neural signatures of that, neural signatures of ASD, maybe not necessarily of the overlap, but we'll look at that anyway and kind of see what we find. So what we did was we wanted to take kind of an atheoretical approach, a data-driven approach. There were these resting state networks that were examined and that we have data for. And so, we could make hypotheses related to, maybe the default mode network, maybe the Sanos network, et cetera, but there's not enough out there related to this connection between autism and schizophrenia to really help us know for sure what would be a strong a priori hypothesis. And so given that we have all this data, we thought, okay, what if we take an atheoretical approach? We set up a model. We include connectivity between all of these resting state networks. And And we also add some other variables. We add in sex, we add age at time of interview, we add mean motion. The reason we're doing this is because so having sex is a little bit of a built-in control, because we know that kids who are male are much more likely to have autism, right? Like we know that that's kind of a demographic fact. Similarly, we know that age is going to be a factor related to psychotic symptoms. We know that older kids are more likely than younger kids to have psychotic symptoms. And then motion is something that is kind of tough to control for. So we throw that in just to kind of make sure that we are looking at things on an even keel. Now, what we did was we put these features into random forest models, and class imbalances is what happens when you have like a huge disparity between, like the number of cases and the number of, youth who don't have whatever the outcome of interest is. So, that's the case with autism and with psychosis to a degree, in the sense that most of the kids in our sample don't have autism. Most of the kids don't have psychosis. So again, that's the strength and the weakness of using what's supposed to be a normative population sample. The reason this is an issue is because you could try to train a machine learning model here, and if you didn't try to address this class imbalance, then it could say, well, I'm just going to look at whether or not this kid has autism, and that's going to be the way I'm going to predict whether or not the kid has autism. Like that in and of itself is going to be the most important predictor. So you want to make sure that sort of thing doesn't happen, because then you end up with something that is technically very accurate, but that actually isn't helpful at all, and it won't generalize. So then we used out-of-bag error scores to kind of assess the performance of the models. And in order to calculate sort of global feature importance, we calculated the relative importance of features. We were able to kind of generate what are the most important, what are the 5 or so most important features that predict each outcome. And so the 3 outcomes that we looked at were psychosis without ASD, ASD without psychosis, and both ASD and psychosis. And this is kind of in descending order of how accurate this model is likely to be, because here we have the largest N. We have just under 300 kids with psychosis, but no ASD. And then when we get down to both ASD and psychosis, we only have 6 kids who have that. So anyway, looking at psychosis with no ASD, the most important feature, so somewhat interestingly, we see the 3 of the most important features are actually not connectivity features at all. They're sex, their mean motion in the scanner, mean head motion, and interview age. Interview age, again, makes sense because older kids are going to be just more likely to have psychotic symptoms. Sex sort of makes sense because in clinically high-risk populations, often when you look at the demographics of those clinics, a majority of the youth who go on to convert are male, and that may be an artifact of the fact that males are more likely in the natural course of psychosis, more likely to develop psychosis early. This is kind of unhelpful when you think about it in the context of autism, though, because again, maleness is also predictive of autism. So this isn't too helpful. Neither really is the mean head motion. But what is sort of interesting is we have this the sensory motor connectivity, and we have this default mode network connectivity, default mode network to the ventral tegmental area. And this is consistent with some literature that talks about the default mode network in schizophrenia and in psychosis in general. Now, looking at our next model, we're looking at predictors of ASD, no psychosis. Unsurprisingly, we see that sex is the single most important feature. Again, we would expect that. And then we see here that there's this dorsal attention network to salience network connectivity. And again, this is interesting in light of literature that describes, the salience network in the context of autism. And then you also see within network connectivity is a strong predictor. One sort of interesting rule of thumb, which is sort of an oversimplification, but is an interesting heuristic way of thinking about autism versus schizophrenia, is that autism is often characterized by stronger within network connectivity, but weaker between network connectivity. And schizophrenia is often characterized by the opposite, by stronger between network connectivity, but weaker within network connectivity. And so we may be seeing that reflected here. This last one is the model that's based on, these 6 kids. So, it's really not clear the extent to which this generalizes. And what you see here is really kind of a combination of features that show up in both of the other models. There's the salience network here, sensory motor mouth and sensory motor hand. Those showed up in that initial psychosis model. salience network again. So again, I'm not sure how useful this last one is. But when you put these three findings into context, what you find is that sex is, again, an important thing to look at, both for ASD and for psychosis in youth. And we need to find some kind of way of disentangling this, of kind of looking at, looking at predictors of psychosis other than maleness within the autism population, because maleness can be a little bit confusing. Age is interesting too, because the other piece that's important here from a clinical standpoint is onset of symptoms, timing of onset of symptoms. So if you, often if you have autism, and if you have like a very strong interest that kind of develops into a, almost develops an obsessive quality, and people are wondering, is this delusional? Is this, is this shading over into psychosis? One way to answer that question can be looking at onset of symptoms. Like, was this something that was really essentially always the case? And is it not particularly stronger now than it used to be? Or is this kind of a new thing? Because I think something being a new thing that happens as you get older points more towards it being psychosis. And I think that our results are consistent with that. I think our results are also consistent with this idea that default mode and salience network connectivity patterns may help us differentiate autism from psychosis. I think we need to kind of think about this and refine, like a stronger hypothesis to kind of look at this. But it may well be that kind of looking at these large scale brain networks is gonna kind of help us differentiate these two disorders from each other. The last point here I think is clear, given that ABCD is a huge cohort. Even though we weren't looking at the full 10,000 kids, we were looking at 6,000 plus kids who were scanned with Siemens machines. And we still, we're really only able to find a very, very small number of people who had co-occurring ASD and psychosis. So if, I'm interested in this question, I need to start thinking about different, better ways of kind of apprehending this question. Because on an individual level, it's just not that common. Autism is maybe about 2% of the population, 1 to 2%. Schizophrenia is going to be maybe 3 to 4% of the autism population. So it's a small percentage of a small percentage. And so that's another sort of an issue there. But just sort of to wrap up, I'd like to thank my mentors, my collaborators, and I'll point you towards our clinical paper, which is here on medRxiv, and here's the DOI. And this doesn't describe the fMRI stuff that I discussed just now, but it does describe like the demographics of the ABCD sample, and some of our strategy in terms of how we identified, youth that we considered psychotic, and how we validated our measure of, whether or not they likely have ASD. So that's about it. Thanks a lot.